Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Maze Runner. It is yet another YA or young adult film adaptation and potential franchise for a studio. And although I think The Maze Runner is actually a little better made than a lot of young adult franchises, other than The Hunger Games, of course, but it still falls under all of those plot points it's supposed to. It very much feels like a genre film adaptation. As much as it breaks away from that, it still takes in all those plot points. So at the beginning, when you feel like you're watching a different kind of movie that it's being advertised as, when you get further along in Maze Runner, the more you're like, oh, I've kind of seen this in Hunger Games and Divergent. It becomes less and less interesting because of that. With these young adult film adaptations, it feels a lot like a young adult novel or any books for kids that you'd get at like the Scholastic Book Fair or like Goosebumps or something. Sure, it's great that kids are reading, and it's great that teenagers are going to the movies, but seeing things like this, they're not great movies. It's not even a great or adventurous genre, and a genre that acts like it's saying something and really isn't. I look at this as my parents looked at the books I read when I was like 13 or something, and they would go, oh, well, you know, eventually he'll grow out of these like Goosebump books and then he'll move on to real novels. And I think with Maze Runner and this whole genre, I kind of feel that way with teenagers who feel like this is more towards them, but hopefully eventually they will grow up and get rid of this drivel and see real movies. Thomas, who comes up to this strange world called the Glade, where it's in the middle of this giant maze, and how this world works is once a month a new person or a greenie is brought up through this creaky metal elevator. None of them know how they got there or why they're there. They eventually remember their names after like a day. Thomas got hit to the ground and then suddenly he remembered it. Kind of like in a sitcom when somebody gets hit in the head and then they suddenly become a different person for a little bit. It's just like that, but he remembered his name. But all the kids remember their names. They don't remember anything else or what the world's like or anything. They're surrounded by this maze, and they have a kind of perfect society where there's balance and various people have various tasks and everyone's equal. And then Thomas shows up and starts questioning everything, just like in most young adult film adaptations. And there are two people who are runners, and they go run through the maze because I guess it's faster, and try to figure out how to eventually get out, but they've been trying for about 3 years. And Thomas starts unlocking secrets within the maze, kills a griever, and starts winning the respect of the other kids in the Glade, and starts solving the mysteries of this place as more mysteries start unfolding about himself, and more questions arise as they try to figure out how to get out of their imprisonment in this maze. Most of the young adult film adaptations are done by older and more experienced directors, which is kind of surprising. You'd think that based on its target demographic that this would be something younger directors would do. If you look at Philip Noyce, who did The Giver, or if you look at the director of Hunger Games, Gary Ross, he directed Pleasantville. These are well-established directors. It's kind of interesting that Maze Runner was directed by Wes Ball. This is his first feature film. I feel like he had a little more to prove than those directors did. This film isn't directed as blandly as something like Divergent, and the way he uses the cinematography gives it more of kind of a natural approach. You really get the sense of the sun. Supposedly he watched a lot of Terrence Malick to give this more of a Terrence Malick look. I didn't really see that in this movie. I know I've read it in a lot of different press and reviews and interviews, but it is a lot better shot than pretty much any young adult film adaptation I've seen other than The Hunger Games. It made this film feel like more of an exception to its genre rather than falling under the trappings of it. If you compare this especially to something like Divergent, which felt too much like a carbon copy of The Hunger Games and everything this genre does, Maze Runner isn't really like that and kind of has a little more fun with the whole genre. Usually with both Hunger Games and Divergent, you as the audience is thrown into the world, but there's not an audience surrogate, so people are explaining the world to them organically because they don't know what's going on, so it kind of makes sense. You always have to have this kind of clumsy situation where like Shailene Woodley explains the world of Divergent. It's clumsy, it's stupid, they have to do it because you won't understand what's going on. One of the pros of Maze Runner is because Thomas, played by Dylan O'Brien, comes in and they have to explain everything to him, it makes a little more sense. that they have to have all this exposition there. It's obviously exposition, but they've actually found a use for it, so it doesn't feel as annoying and eye-rolling as usually that does in this kind of a film. He would look at stuff like, oh, I'm questioning things already. He doesn't have really that much of a character arc. It feels like his Thomas just kind of goes in and is just like crazy and brave. Like, you don't really grow with him as an audience. He just does these things. Dylan O'Brien does his best with it. He seems like he's probably a good actor. I've never watched MTV's Teen Wolf, but you don't really grow with the character because you always kind of understand he's going to be the one who changes this whole world. And that's really kind of one of the problems with this film and the whole genre in general, is you know this guy's gonna come in and change everything, blow everybody's minds and change the world. You could just tell he's going to do that, but you don't get the point of the character. I liked a lot of the supporting actors in this film, and I think they got a good supporting cast. I actually felt like I understood all of those characters more because you got more of an arc, because you got to see them be affected by this new guy with these new ideas more than the guy with the ideas. I don't know how much of this was from the books or wasn't, but there did feel like a lot of moments that could have been cut out, and a plot point that could have been handled in one scene but went on longer. There's a part where Thomas is put in jail just to make sure everyone's following the rules, but we could have really done without that. He could have just had an argument with the stricter guy and we would have been fine. I did like Will Poulter. He was really good as Gally, who was the more conservative member who didn't really want to leave the Glade. If there is an antagonist, it's definitely him. He was very hateable, and he's the character I had the strongest reaction to as an audience member. I understood why he was upset. You got like how he was at the beginning versus how he was when like people were dying and things were changing, and you really got that with him. So I think actually he probably did have the best arc of everyone. With something like this, it definitely makes you think that someone could make a good young adult movie out of some of these books if they were able to adapt it more, but it feel like kind of brought down by the books, like cumbersome almost, because they can't do a wild film adaptation because the fans would be upset and that would make it less marketable and such. So I kind of wish you'd get a real good director to sink their teeth into one of these, because I've almost gotten sick of seeing studio directors do stuff like this. Wes Ball, who this is his first big feature film, and he obviously had something more to prove than those older guys, and he did a little bit more with it and shot it differently than a lot of those guys would, and it kind of gives it a better flavor to it, but it's almost like not enough. Like, we've sat through enough of these stupid things that I think you really need to be incredibly different. Sure, this does a lot of things better than the genre has done before. It's kind of the dribble that the kids who are into these sort of things like, because they feel safe within that genre. They're not challenged by it. There's nothing that's going to challenge them as an audience, and I can't think of another genre in film right now. They're so held to that genre. They're like kind of constrained by it and they can't let go. And that's the biggest problem with this. These film adaptations have become really boring, and even a different take on them is still kind of boring. And I hope the audience will grow up and see actual movies with some actual artistic value behind them, and see different kinds of movies and get into genres that try to challenge you a little bit more. But this is like one of the least challenging genres in film right now, and it doesn't have any motivation not to. It's just so complacent in what it's trying to do. It's more complacent than any genre could ever dream of, because most of them realize the problem with complacency, and these don't have a problem with that whatsoever. So if you have seen The Maze Runner and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. Still there? Cool.